So we're going to be recording tonight's meeting so that those that can't attend can watch afterwards. As you all know, that right now the people on video are those that are presenting, but when you're recognized to speak, if you choose to speak, you can, if you prefer to not be recorded, you can just turn your camera off, and we will really save that. So without further ado, we want to go ahead and get started. We'll do a little round of introduction so you know who's speaking with you, and then we'll jump into the agenda. So my name is Zoe Mueller. I'm part of the consultant team supporting the city of Norwalk on this effort. I'm the project manager. My background is as an urban planner. We have Steve go ahead and introduce himself.
Sure, Steve Kleppen with the Planning and Zoning Office. I'm going to try to do this off the cuff, just to acknowledge the members of the Oversight Committee. Some of them are in attendance in the webinar, but just to acknowledge them. We do have John Romano and John Pinto from the Harbor Management Commission. We have Louis Schulman, Dick Rowena, and Tammy Langalis from the Planning and Zoning Commission, John Kites and Darlene Young from Common Council. Michelle, who am I missing? Because I know that's not the entire list.
I believe we have Carly Kramer from the Redevelopment Authority, and also I think Sabrina from City Team.
Yep, thank you. I knew I was going to forget a couple.
I think that's it.
Okay.
All right, Michelle, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Michelle Anjeski, Planning and Zoning Department.
Great, and Tim?
Tim Law from UTIL. I'm working with Zoe, Gabriel, and the rest of our team on this project.
Great, and Gabriel, you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriel Ramos, also working with UTIL. My background is in urban planning. Thank you.
Great. So we'll have some opportunity later on in the conversation and our presentation for you to sort of join in with us and engage in a conversation, but we'll also kind of, before doing that, we'll walk you through a little bit of where we're at in the planning process, and sort of a little bit of what we have prepared for you today. So
I think one thing, Zoe, that might be worth doing, or Michelle, is to explain the format. There's a lot of questions in the chat about why people aren't on camera and they aren't being heard. Do you want to just explain this format of Zoom? It might be unfamiliar to some people.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a webinar format, which enables us to have a more structured Q&A session. So we'll be, for a couple points during the meeting, we'll open it up for Q&A, at which time you can be recognized, you can speak and join in the conversation. And in the meantime, you can interact with us via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and also via the chat. We welcome your input. We found that this provides a little bit of a better experience for people when we're doing sort of meetings with this kind of complexity. So rest assured, there'll be opportunity for you to converse with us, and we're really excited to hear from you. So with that, just to give you a feel for our agenda today, we'll start with a little bit of Zoom etiquette to get you guys oriented, sort of building on what I just said. We'll walk you through a little bit of the engagement process so far, what we've learned from that process. We'll go through a little bit of the draft plan framework, so giving you a sense of sort of guiding principles, values that sort of are guiding the more specific recommendations. And then we'll walk you through 3 aspects of the draft recommendations for the plan: the land use vision, the capital investment for public benefits, and the policy that's linking development to those public benefits. And you'll see at a couple different points here, we have a sort of dedicated pause for Q&A. You're also welcome to submit questions in the meantime via the Q&A function. We'll do our best to answer them as they come in, but then we'll pause and address any that we weren't able to get to. For a little bit of kind of Zoom etiquette, if you'd like to speak, please just use the raise hand tool. It's the one that sort of shows you the palm at the bottom of your screen. You can get to it from the participants section as well. And then we'll have the Q&A function open for the entirety of the presentation. You can see it using that the Q&A icon there, and then the chat is also available for more general kind of discussion. We'll sort of prompt a couple points where we're looking for your additional input when we're doing interactive polls. When we do get to the Q&A session, if you could please be respectful of each other's time and sort of keep your comments brief as much as possible, that will make sure that we're able to get to as many questions as possible during the time we have. And then if there's anything that we're not able to get to, you can reach out to the planning team and we'll be happy to provide responses afterwards. Okay. So without further ado, we'll jump into a little bit of the content here. So in general, sort of big picture, the goal of this planning process is to streamline and modernize industrial zoning with the intent to preserve and enhance the character, improve quality of life, and promote economic development. So this is kind of a broad effort that is specifically focused on the waterfront. And we're through this process looking to sort of arrive at a vision that's sort of balanced, that can be used to guide development going forward, provide a sort of a pathway for an integrated and balanced public benefits framework that takes into account all the feedback that we've been hearing from you all, and also gives a clear sort of strategic alignment for policy change where needed. This is also kind of related to a lot of other kind of ongoing planning processes, both in terms of the comprehensive rezoning for the city of Norwalk, as well as more specific infrastructure and capital investment plans. So we're really this is one of several more specific or targeted studies that will then filter up into the rezoning effort and inform that effort. Similarly, this is also sort of with the focus of the waterfront, we're also gathering together relevant capital investment plans related to the waterfront. So the Harbor Loop Plan, Parks and Recreation Master Planning, Transportation Master Planning, so that we're kind of able to represent all of those things side by side. And we're really getting close to sort of the finish line here. So our intent is to share with you kind of a draft plan so that you can understand where we're headed and we can get a little bit of feedback before we get to the final stages of putting together the report. So with that, we wanted to provide an overview of what we've heard so far from you all and a little bit of the sort of what's coming up. So first of all, kind of who did we hear from and what were our tools? So this is kind of the full planning process from start to finish. We started with a lot of stakeholder meetings to interview individuals that were sort of most involved in the waterfront. And then we moved into a more public phase of the project where we did a series of digital and in-person interactive mapping and surveys. And then the last public meeting, and this is our second and final public meeting, will then following this move to putting together the final report and getting feedback on that before moving through the adoption process. And really throughout the whole sort of process, we were really looking to balance stakeholder and community input. So recognizing that our stakeholders may not represent the full range of sort of the Norwalk community. And so we wanted to make sure we're hearing from members of the public as well as stakeholders that were most impacted in terms of their properties and businesses in this area. So by the numbers, we had 58 kind of stakeholder interviews. We have, as Steve had mentioned, we have our oversight committee, which provided us a lot of ongoing feedback throughout the process. We had our public and community meetings, a lot of interaction with our online mapping tools and surveys, and then also with our physical boards, which went up in a couple of different locations throughout Norwalk. This is an example of the in-person boards, which just gave us a little bit more of a visibility for the project and an opportunity to engage with people that might not be learning about it otherwise. And so far, we've thankfully heard from people who are, generally speaking, most impacted by the changes to the study area. So people who live within walking distance of the study area, property and business owners, recreational users, workers in the study area, as well as zip codes that are within our study area. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and launch our first poll. So this will give us, ask basically the same questions as here. So we're curious, for those of you who are attending with us tonight, what is your relationship to the study area for this planning process? Are you a resident, business owner, recreational user, et cetera? And also what's your zip code? That gives us a sense of kind of geographically within the city of Norwalk, kind of who we're hearing from. We'll leave this open for a few minutes while you make your selections, and then we'll share the results with you. Yeah, Michelle, when you see that we're at sort of approaching like, 50% to 75% participation, you can go ahead and close it out. Okay, we can go ahead and share the results. So you can see here that the majority are Norwalk residents within walking distance of our study area. And that we have also some residents from beyond the walking distance of the study area, less representation from the other groups. And then we're hearing more from people living in 06854, so much of the Western Norwalk. Great, thank you for that. So based on all of the engagement that we've done so far, there's a couple of things that have sort of bubbled up as sort of consistent themes or input that we've received in a couple different ways. So one of the things that came through really strongly is that there's a lot of public sort of concern and interest in public access, open space, sort of environmental considerations and infrastructure. There was a lot less, in particular in our first public input activity, there was less of a sort of focus on land use and zoning, which is okay. So that we kind of like balanced that in with some of the other feedback we were getting, but really came through strong that there was an interest in seeing how this plan could contribute to the environmental issues in the area. Then when we sort of subsequently in our last public meeting and the sort of associated online tools and in-person boards, we heard sort of loud and clear that there was a strong interest from the public in beautification, ecology, and public access. And this resonated in large part with what we heard from stakeholders as well, who consistently brought up the need to address contamination, water quality, and flood resilience issues. We also heard a lot from different sort of stakeholders that there is an interest in sort of public access, recreation, hospitality network in a way that was obviously site specific, to different areas of the harbor and the different needs of those areas. Those were kind of the areas of like where we saw a lot of consensus and agreement and a consistent patterning. Some of the sort of areas where there was more debate, contention, or anxiety was around kind of, in particular for land uses, the degree to which we're protecting and preserving existing uses versus transitioning and introducing new uses. There's also differing visions for what growth and sort of public access on the waterfront should look like. So we did our best to kind of balance those areas. And then finally, this is a little bit outside of the sort of scope of this study, but there was a lot of conversation about dredging and sort of the sort of risks and rewards or costs and benefits of dredging along the harbor. So with that, I wanted to kind of jump into our draft plan framework, and then we'll have a pause for Q&A in just a couple slides. So there's really three core elements of the sort of plan framework that we're proposing at this point. And these are really designed to be kind of metrics for us to evaluate, the degree to which we're sort of delivering on some of the values that we heard from you all. So the first is making sure that our recommendations are site specific, that they're sensitive to the context, that they're responding to the the physical surroundings and the existing conditions on the ground in Norwalk. So they're not just abstracted, they're really responding to the sort of conditions in Norwalk currently. The second is that we're sharing a cohesive and balanced public benefits framework. So it's taking into account some of those things that are maybe in tension with one another, but that need to be balanced on the waterfront. And then finally, that we're providing an integrated and aligned policy and planning foundation. This is really important for all waterfronts where you have this kind of layering of local regulations, state regulations, and federal regulations that can get really complicated. So I'll walk you through a little bit of what kind of I mean by this first one, the sort of site-specific context-sensitive approach to land use and development intensity. So we took a really close look at the structure of the waterfront in Norwalk and identified different sort of areas with distinctive character from one another and with shared issues and opportunities. So we looked at the physical barriers, so things like topography, infrastructure, and road network. We looked at the hydrology, so things like flood risk and impervious surfaces. We looked at the water use currently, so public ownership, water access, and water dependent uses. And then finally, we also looked at some more kind of development oriented metrics. So things like the current land use, the zoning, and the parcel and building types that sort of affect what kind of development can occur in different places. And with all of this, one of the things that was really distinctive from the get-go was the way in which topography influences Norwalk's sort of land use patterns. So in particular in the inner harbor, there's almost a one-story difference in topography. And so this really results in different activities at different sort of elevations within the harbor. And so we wanted to kind of recognize that and have the land use, respond in the same way that we're seeing it is already. So after kind of doing all of that, more detailed look at the way that Norwalk is structured, we came up with these kind of 19, smaller character areas that had distinctive issues and characteristics, and then sort of clustered them into these 5 larger districts that had sort of shared issues or shared kind of questions to contend with. And so that was really the focal point of our last public meeting, was understanding these 5 districts and talking through land use options for each of them. The second piece here about public benefits framework, this is really to the earlier slide that I had mentioned, the things where there was maybe tension or debate amongst the sort of the people that we've spoken to so far. And so really what we wanted to offer with this plan is a mechanism to balance all of those needs, right? So we have the need for a vibrant, diverse, and resilient marine economy, the desire to have a desirable, distinctive, and dynamic experience for residents and visitors alike. And finally, a healthy, sustainable, and resilient ecosystem. So we heard, all of these things in different ways were really important values and things that people wanted to see invested in and supported along Norwalk's waterfront. And so what we're really offering is sort of pulling that all together and sort of presenting them as a cohesive set of values that need to be advanced by development going forward. And then finally, I mentioned this briefly before, waterfronts all over the US and the world are very complicated places from a policy and regulation standpoint. They usually have these multiple layers, and Norwalk is no exception. There's the local zoning and regulatory processes. There's then the state regulations that dictate what can and cannot happen, and the sort of policy objectives that are tied to those. And then finally, there's the federal regulations. So in particular for Norwalk, we have the floodplain, which is a federal regulation that has implications for what kinds of construction is allowed, and the precautions you have to take, insurance, and all things like that. We then have the coastal management zone boundary, which is tied to state level regulations. And then finally, of course, the local zoning. So this is really why it's important that this plan provides a really clear, integrated foundation that is touching on the different goals and values of each of those layers of regulation and is providing a sort of a unified sort of path forward within that. So with that, we will jump into, we'll pause for Q&A. So I know there's been some activity in the chat and in the Q&A section, so I will go ahead and open that up. So it looks like we have one question that is still open. So that has not yet been answered via the sort of text Q&A here. So there's a question of how was social pinpoint input collected on these issues incorporated into the report? So that's a great question. So we have, we used social pinpoint twice. The first time was a more kind of open-ended set of questions. And then the second one was a more focused set of questions that was really the same set of questions that we asked at the last public meeting. So in both cases, we sort of took that input and synthesized it, and is part of what we were just reporting back to you on. So that really helped us to solidify in particular the public benefits framework. We heard a lot of input on the environmental issues that people wanted to see addressed in this planning process. And so ultimately you'll see that reflected in sort of how we articulate that public benefits framework. There were also in the second round of the social pinpoint, we asked more focused questions about the specific land use scenarios that we were evaluating for each of the districts. And so that those results then we're reporting back on those in sort of the next section of this presentation to share with you that those responses, along with the same responses that we sort of received during the public meeting. So,
and Zoe, I also will type in a kind of concise answer too. I think there's a second question that came up that I'm partly responsible for because I misinterpreted a question about why this is a Zoom meeting versus a live meeting. And I think Steve agreed to answer that.
Sure. Steve, are you able to jump in?
Yes. Yeah, so at this point in time, the city has not authorized the in-person meetings. I believe Common Council might be doing that, but everybody else is still remote. And at the moment, I haven't heard anything that when that will change. So that's why we're using the format.
I think we're all pretty eager to get back to in-person, but there's certainly still constraints.
There's a new question that was posted by John Romano. If you want to respond to that, Steve.
I can read it out for you. So John asked, back in the 80s, DEEP made an agreement not to follow up on a lawsuit with Norwalk when the Marine Industrial Zone was formulated. Can you share what was that exact agreement?
I do not. I'd have to see if someone in the law department has access to that. I was not employed at the city of Norwalk in the 80s, so I don't know.
Okay, we've had a couple more come in, so I'll read them off as we have them. So another one, we know that we have had multiple storms designated as 100-year storms in the past 10 years. In 1 year period of time, we had 3. Why isn't that being considered in your mapping? So I can offer an initial response to that. So this is absolutely part of our, so earlier when I had mentioned the sort of character areas that we'd sort of grouped different areas based on sort of shared issues and opportunities. One of those considerations was their relationship to the floodplain. So understanding that, you know, in many cases, our 100-year storms are coming more frequently. You know, we did want to plan for that relative to land use considerations. And so that's sort of, you know, embedded in some of our considerations. We're not necessarily at liberty to, you know, halt development altogether. That's not something that local jurisdiction has the authority to do, but we can shape what kinds of land uses go there so that they're an appropriate match for the level of flood risk. We've got one more that says, how much control does Norwalk really have if most of the waterfront land comes under either federal or state jurisdiction? So it's a great question. So it's exactly why we need to kind of have this layered approach. There's still quite a bit that can be done within local zoning, but it has to be in relationship to those other sort of state and federal considerations. So you might think of it as sort of a set of guidelines that are coming from state and federal regulations that then within those guidelines, local zoning can have a lot of influence in, how that plays out. But it certainly they're important constraints and they can't be overlooked. I don't know, Steve, if you want to add anything to that.
Sorry, I was skimming down the other questions as you were talking. Yes, so we are definitely taking it into account what and are keeping the state. Actually invited them tonight. They could not attend, but we'll be sending them the link to the meeting. We've had conversations with the different branches of DEEP, and we'll continue to do so. And obviously, if in the final approval stages of the plan, this has to get referred out to DEEP for comment as well, so that process will continue.
Okay, we've got another one says, if buildings need to be evacuated to meet FEMA, how is this going to affect the overall height of the proposed buildings? So I think I'll defer maybe a little bit to Tim on this one, but I think in general, it's not just the density or height of the building, it's also the ways in which the building is responding to and protecting inhabitants from those floods.
That's right. It wouldn't, any consideration, at later stages of planning for this, and maybe it's partly an answer to John Romano's question too about, hearings for zoning changes. This would not change the total allowable heights for buildings. It just means that the first floor of the buildings wouldn't be occupiable. So it doesn't mean that the buildings are going to get taller necessarily. And any future zoning recommendation to deal with issues of being in the floodplain. I also think it's worth clarifying, maybe Steve can add a little bit more detail to this. This is a planning document to tee up considerations for a future rezoning process that would include all of the required public hearings that would be necessary for actual rezoning. This is a plan. It's not that includes some rezoning recommendations, but it's not the rezoning effort itself. Steve, do you want to add to that?
Sure, and the consultant that's working on the zoning rewrite has been informed of the process and is aware of where we're at, and understands the issues related to what Mr. Garcia had indicated, and actually has provided some building typology that in the future going forward could very well work for this area. I think is in line with some of the things we've talked about, and we're very cognizant of the fact that there could be flooding in this area, and there could be more in the future. So that's definitely something we're considering.
Great. So I think we have just a couple more questions. I think in the interest of time, since several of these are starting to move more towards some of the more specific recommendations, I'm inclined to go ahead and present the next section of our presentation, and then we'll have an additional opportunity for Q&A, and we'll start to address these through that.
Sure, and I'll do some of the question Q&A in the chat too as well, so we can keep going.
Great. All right. So a lot of what the questions we've already started to answer relate to some of the more detailed recommendations, which is absolutely understandable because this is a lot of the devil's in the details, as the old saying goes. So I'll jump into a little bit of that. So our draft recommendations that we're sharing with you tonight are in kind of three categories. The first is the land use vision. This is what a lot of our engagement has been about so far. is really trying to get a feeling from the public and from stakeholders about what kinds of land uses they'd like to see along the waterfront. And then additionally, we have been coordinating with a lot of other public agencies to understand, what kind of capital investment is already underway or in the works or planned for the waterfront, so that we can incorporate those considerations into this plan and sort of recognize them and their relationship to one another. And then finally, we've also started to identify some opportunities for the future zoning to sort of explicitly include, parameters or guidelines that can help to link future development to the delivery of some of the public benefits that we've heard from you all are sort of important for the future of the city of Norwalk and for the waterfront in particular. So I'll go through them in sequence. First, for the land use vision, I wanted to take us back for just a moment to the study that was the precursor for this one, which sort of informed some of the terminology that we're using in the subsequent slides. So this previous effort was really designed or intended to help streamline and modernize the industrial zoning in Norwalk, looking across the entire city, so not focused on the waterfront. And the waterfront was specifically sort of sectioned off because it had more complex and sort of distinctive considerations that needed to be sort of evaluated in greater detail. So that's what we're kind of doing today. So the outcome of that prior study was these four classifications. The first, heavy industrial, which is sort of what a lot of us traditionally think of as industrial, and then progressively less intensive from there, a mixed use heavy industrial and commercial, a mixed use light industrial commercial, and a mixed use artisan. So there's kind of a broader vision for the city as a whole that uses those four categories. The idea being that heavy industry like this is, for example, Divine Brothers on, just near the CBD, has a very different sort of feel than a more kind of light industry, which is sort of maybe closer to warehousing or has, more of a sort of compatible relationship with other land uses. And then boutique manufacturing, which in many cases can, coexist with residential, is sort of interchangeable with retail in a lot of ways in terms of the way that it uses space and sort of how it functions on the street. And so the idea is that the sort of land use classifications should align with those sort of broader compatibility issues, and that they should be kind of providing a spectrum from, more residential uses and traditional CBD uses to heavier industrial districts. So we'll be using these kind of colors and terminology in the subsequent slides to talk about this. But sort of conceptually, what you can think of is sort of larger scale, more intensive uses are sort of at home within the heavy industrial zone. And then as you move towards the mixed use, heavy industrial and commercial, that one is really, for all intents and purposes, its core is sort of a light industrial, but it allows selectively for heavier industrial uses where they're sort of through special permit deemed to be compatible with what's around them. And then the light industrial commercial is more like what you might expect for R&D, light manufacturing, warehousing and transportation. And then finally, mixed use artisan is sort of similar to what you might see for downtown zoning. It's sort of a mixed use zone that allows for residential and only allows for the kinds of manufacturing and industrial uses that are compatible with residential. So this is kind of, broadly speaking, this is like the framework that we're bringing to the waterfront and customizing to the waterfront. So the current zoning is pictured here. You can see there's quite a few different zones. They each have sort of different parameters, and you can see there's quite a bit of heavy industrial along the waterfront, as well as marine commercial and a couple of other sort of mixed use neighborhood business zones as well. With the sort of previous study, we brought up to that waterfront boundary this vision for a sort of clearer industrial zoning framework. You can see that in a lot of places there's the mixed use artisan category is right sort of abutting the waterfront study area. And so with that, I want to kind of walk you through the, within the waterfront study area, what we're recommending at this point. So there's quite a few areas where there's a pretty clear consensus or outcome from the engagement so far. And so those areas are sort of colored in here with their appropriate land use category. And then there's a couple areas that you'll see in gray here, the sort of right near Constitution Park, the area under I-95, this sort of buffer between Crescent and Harbor Avenue and the rail line, and the current kind of O&G site just down the hill from Mill Hill Park. So these are areas where there was a little bit of remaining uncertainty or sort of a couple alternatives that seemed like good outcomes for the city that we wanted to put forward. So I'll go through them one by one. In the area by the CBD, this area was, there's really clear public preference for lower impact uses that are more compatible with residential, CBD, and open space or recreational uses. This area is currently zoned for heavy industrial. So our recommendation is that it go to a lower intensity zone. So mixed use heavy industrial commercial or mixed use light industrial commercial, pictured here. The idea being that it is providing an improved buffer for the neighborhood, but that this gives a little bit of flexibility to address sort of site specific, business specific, property specific needs, so that there's sort of a path forward that's responsive to the individual business owners' needs that are there right now. For the mini industrial marina district, as we're calling it, the stretch that sort of tucks under I-95, there was again a clear public preference for lower impact light industrial and R&D uses. There was, however, there's also kind of a recognition these are in a lot of cases lower visibility sites that are already well buffered from residential neighborhoods nearby in some cases, and that there's a really strong existing marina base in this area. And so there's a sort of a potential to build on that going forward. So in this area, similarly, we had suggested that the parts that are already being used predominantly as marine commercial be zoned as such. So picking up the same general sort of framework that exists along Water Street for marine commercial. And then these, parcels that do not have the same potential as marine commercial sites be zoned for the either mixed use artisan, mixed use heavy industrial commercial, or mixed use light industrial commercial, again, based on sort of site specific and business specific needs for those sites, and understanding their sort of long-term economic development potential. But the intention there is that they serve as a bit of a buffer to the residential neighborhoods surrounding them. For the East Bank heavy industrial site that's currently owned by O&G, this site, there's a public preference for public open space or recreational uses. So that's a great long-term potential for this site. It is dependent on the sort of funding being in place and sort of the project initiative moving forward. And so we thought it wise to sort of include a broader range of options for this site, including, of course, that open space preference that we heard from the public, but recognizing that there might be some other uses that would also be beneficial there if the sort of open space does not move forward or isn't sort of materializing. This is also a really important site for sort of water dependent industrial capacity. So that's also sort of an important consideration to balance with the sort of ecological piece. So here we see there's a potential for 3 good outcomes. Each would have a different relationship to the city overall, but each would contribute positively. So 1 being open space, 2 being mixed use artisan, and 3 being marine commercial, which is sort of a sort of recognition of the existing industrial character of this area, and also its relationship to the navigational channel, and the existence of a bulkhead on the site, all of which make it a sort of important asset for marine commercial. And finally, the last area that we sort of wanted to provide some optionality for was the area that's sort of going to be used for the staging for the walk bridge investment going forward, that once it is sort of served that purpose, it will come back into productive use for other needs. And so the idea is that, we should have a sense of where this, what the optimal use of this site is once it's available. There was, in our last public meeting, a preference for this becoming open space, again, with the same sort of big picture view as the O&G site, where there was a preference for open space. This was, this site also has, significant value as a marine commercial site, or as an expansion site or sort of swing space for any investment needed to improve upon the essential industrial services that are currently along the waterfront. So public works, waste transfer, wastewater treatment. And so the idea here is that, there are, again, kind of 3 positive outcomes, all of which would be acceptable and contributed well to the overall composition of the waterfront, 1 being open space, 2 being marine commercial, and 3 being essential industrial public services, with the caveat that, for the essential public industrial services, that would really only be considered if there was a demonstrated need for expanded waterfront capacity for one of those essential services that is sort of providing a service to the public and needs industrial space. So with all of that, to sort of step back for a moment from those more kind of site-specific or granular considerations, one of the kind of big picture outcomes that we're offering at this point is the ability to basically take stock of all of the current active use of the waterfront, and to make the zoning more accurately match and protect those sort of areas of the waterfront where there is these sort of critical water dependent uses. And so with what we just sort of walked through, if you consider the potential for each of those sites to become marine commercial, we're looking at up to a 25% increase in marine commercial zone across the entirety of Norwalk, which would help to provide a little bit of an offset, a little bit of security, long-term sort of protection for those water dependent businesses that are currently concentrated predominantly along Water Street. And this is kind of a big picture idea that sort of emerged between the last public meeting and this one, based on sort of our conversations with Deep and with different sort of members of the public. So we wanted to sort of share back to you and ask you, what your thoughts are on this. So in particular, we're curious how you feel about this idea of expanding the protected marine commercial zones on the waterfront, if you think it's sort of positive, negative, whatever it may be. And additionally, of the areas that we've talked about, which area do you think is most important to prioritize for marine commercial that would be particularly valuable or well suited to it? So with that, Michelle, if you can launch the next poll number 2. We'll do the same thing. We'll leave this open for a little while. And then after this, we'll transition to Q&A again.
All right, we're pretty close to half.
Okay, we can maybe leave it open for a little. Yeah, great. If you want to share back to the rest of the group. Okay, so we are seeing that of those who are attending today and were able to submit, that majority think it's a great idea to protect the water dependent uses. Some people who are uncertain one way or other, and about 20% who feel that there might be other uses that would benefit Norwalk more. So it's sort of representative of, I think this is an area of debate, within the community. So it's helpful to just hear kind of where people fall on it. And then of the areas that we talked about today that, are potential expansion areas for marine commercial, the Walk Bridge staging area was the one that the most people felt was important to prioritize for marine commercial. And then the other two are both slightly less, but also important. Great, thank you. Okay, so we have quite a few open questions here. So I think maybe we can start with a comment really, but a reminder to just kind of highlight the relationship of this plan to the Norwalk's Municipal Coastal Program and the Connecticut Coastal Management Act. So this is something that I mentioned sort of briefly earlier with the map that showed the FEMA boundary, the coastal management zone, and then sort of the sort of context of the city. So this has, for a long time been shepherded by many of the people who are on our oversight committee and are on the Harbor Management Commission to really make sure that the waterfront is sort of, the development on the waterfront is guided for beneficial use and conservation of coastal resources. So this is really a critical aspect of the work of the Harbor Management Commission, ongoing work that's provided the foundation for this plan. And what we're really doing is sort of taking that sort of long-term effort, building from it, and looking more specifically at the local zoning and what the local zoning can do to complement those efforts, to reinforce those efforts, and to sort of help navigate the sort of layered regulatory environment that the waterfront is part of. Okay. There's a question of who owns the property at the Walk Bridge staging area. I'm going to defer to Steve. I believe it's in state control currently. Is that correct?
There are several parcels near the Walk Bridge that are being used for staging or will be used for staging when the bridge is rebuilt, and those are at the meantime under state control.
Thank you. Okay. And we have a question. Rowayton, a village district on the water in Norwalk, isn't included in the study, but a new waterfront building recently went up, new condos. Is this what we can expect all around Norwalk with your rezoning? So I think this is a really, certainly our focus has been on the waterfront itself. And on managing the sort of the pressures and opportunities that the waterfront has. I don't think that, increased density residential is the answer to every problem, but it's an important tool to, manage the different pressures that these parcels are dealing with. So our effort has been to really consider where residential development is appropriate, what it can offer the other uses and the city as a whole. And to really, think about that in a balanced context. So I don't know if Steve or Tim wants to sort of add to that at all.
No, but I think in the next section of the presentation that might be clear, which is to be much clearer than under the current zoning where residential can and can't go. And if it is allowed in certain places, what other obligations the development has to meet to be able to build. And so I think that's the centerpiece of one of the recommendations that you'll see a little bit later in the presentation.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm just scrolling through these to get make sure we're answering all of them. For the three proposed uses for the Walk Bridge staging area, there's a comment here really about in particular the essential industrial services portion. This is an area that is actually physically pretty buffered from the areas adjacent to it. It's sort of down the road from the existing residential and commercial areas nearby. So it has in the past been used for more industrial purposes and actually physically has a good sort of buffer from it, but certainly any future development in that area would be considered at a more site-specific level to make sure that it's not negatively impacting the existing uses around it. We've got a request to define marine commercial and examples of uses. So we'll actually, right after this, sort of pause for Q&A. We have a slide that speaks more directly to that. So I'll cover that in a moment.
I think also, Zoe, there's a question about why in some of the sub areas that we're looking at, we have not one, but 2 or 3 recommendations. Do you want to explain a little bit the thinking about that?
Yeah, happy to. And maybe Steve, you can also chime in on this a little bit. So in a lot of areas, there was like a really clear, best case scenario for the area. And in those cases, we went ahead and, in our sort of land use vision, indicated that we thought that was the best possible outcome for that area. In the areas where we've retained these alternatives, it's basically for 2 reasons. One is that zoning is a powerful tool to sort of dictate or shape what uses are allowed in that area. And in some cases, there was, some more detailed follow-up that would really sort of be beneficial in terms of, engagement directly with some of the property owners and businesses in those areas that would be most impacted. And then second, that in the cases where we have shown alternatives, it's because we feel that genuinely those 3 alternatives would all provide, equal but different benefits to the city. And so there's some value in retaining that flexibility so that the city has the ability to respond to the opportunities that present themselves. And that's particularly true for instances where we wouldn't want to prematurely zone for open space before there's resources identified for that purpose, because those things can't just you don't want to have it sit vacant for a long time in the absence of those resources being available. So it's kind of a balancing act of where we feel like there's a single preferred answer. We've really indicated that clearly, but where we think there's several equally valuable alternatives, we've indicated that, and we'll present clearly the sort of benefits and sort of drawbacks or considerations for each of those.
I have nothing to add. Stated very well.
Nice.
Okay, let's see if we can jump through a couple of these ones. There's a question about the residential and recreational use plan and walkways going through all of Norwalk. So public access in a lot of ways is like a separate but parallel consideration to land use, right? That you can have a lot of different use types while still providing public access. And so we have reflected the latest plans from the Norwalk Redevelopment Authority, as well as sort of the local properties along the waterfront, to show where public access is planned, what sort of alignment there's expected to take, and sort of how that might be considered for different sort of development on those properties. So certainly this plan is assuming there will be continued progress towards increased public access and connectivity to all the sort of existing trail network assets. But the sort of the land use will not necessarily be exclusively open space or exclusively residential. It may be other uses as well that are compatible with that sort of public access alignment. Just scrolling through. There's a question about whether the study will permit residential development, for example, 6-story apartment buildings in the study area. is that a fair assessment of where we stand on rezoning? So
we'll be getting to that in the presentation.
Yeah, we'll jump into that next. Moment. And I think there's a good comment about some clear cutting of from utilities and the need for replanting of real trees. So certainly sort of ecological restoration is sort of part of the framework for this plan. Certainly we can't dictate what Eversource chooses to do, but we can state clearly that, you know, things that contribute to ecological restoration are part of the expectation for development in this area. So I think there's a couple more in here that I think will be best addressed by going into the next section. So I'm going to go ahead and keep moving on. For the rest of the team, you can continue to kind of address some of the questions that are sort of listed now, and then we'll return to more of them once we've had the chance to walk through the next section of the presentation. Okay. So this next section is sort of related to some of the questions around public access and capital investment. So this is really, you know, we weren't so much initiating new capital investment proposals, but rather consolidating and sort of synthesizing all of the different capital investment that we are aware of along the waterfront, so that that can be considered in relationship to the land use and development. So you heard me mention that we have been coordinating with the Redevelopment Authority about plans for the Harbor Loop and other kind of trail access network considerations. So in particular, the Redevelopment Authority has been focusing on three important kind of missing links in the Harbor Loop network. So Sono Wharf, 148 East Ave, and 130 East Ave. So these are all kind of moving along to complete those segments of the trail network. And as you can see, there's other kind of portions of the trail network that are on-street connections where there's sort of planned improvements over time. So this is certainly all of the development and land use recommendations that we've put forward are compatible with this sort of vision for the public access network, recognizing that, you know, individual components of it will proceed on different timelines based on funding and sort of, you know, site-specific considerations. In terms of other kinds of capital projects, you can see here kind of the ones that are highlighted in orange are more kind of related to the public facilities, public industrial services along the waterfront. You can see highlighted in blue, different sort of environmental or public open space and recreation considerations. And then in red, more kind of infrastructure improvements for the street network and the city marina. So these are kind of all, you know, on different timelines led by different agencies, but are all kind of, you know, going to have eventually an impact on the look, the feel, the operation of the waterfront. And so we wanted to sort of share that, our latest understanding with all of you and make sure that, you know, any developers or property owners that are, you know, looking at their development options in this area are aware of all of this work and any potential kind of ripple effects for their properties. So if you're aware of anything that you don't see listed in either kind of this diagram or the previous one that showed the public access network, feel free to drop it in the chat and share with us anything that you think we should be highlighting along with these initiatives. And we'll be sure to, you know, take that into consideration and include it in the plan. So I'll, I think of the ones, of the questions I'm seeing here, I think most of them are relating to more so the marine commercial. So I think we can maybe keep moving along, but if anybody has any questions about the capital investment plans that we just shared about, you can feel free to add those in our Q&A here. I see a question of what's a sponge park? So that's sort of a shorthand for exactly what you might imagine. So when you put a sponge somewhere, it absorbs water. A lot of our waterfronts have lost the sort of ecological areas that used to absorb water and sort of retain it to prevent sort of flood damage and such. So a sponge park is basically a floodable park, a park that accommodates and retains water when there's a flood event. So a large rain event or storm surge or a coastal flooding, that it can serve as sort of a protection or a buffer for the areas around it. While, and it's not flooded, it can be a sort of a recreational amenity for the region. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the next one, I think, because all of these are relating more so to marine commercial. Okay, so this section will really kind of be focusing on, in particular, the existing marine commercial along Water Street, but these same principles really apply, to the marine commercial areas that we're suggesting all along the waterfront, and certainly kind of are just a way of more clearly articulating some of the values that the future development should be responding to, and sort of making clear suggestions for how they're going to meet these expectations. So the idea is that the future zoning, which will kind of allow for certain development typologies, should result in public benefits, by virtue of allowing those developments to move forward. In exchange, you'd like to see some level of commitment to the needs and sort of shared values for the city of Norwalk. So in particular for these, water dependent use areas, we're looking at whether the future development is helping to retain, protect, and reinvest in water dependent businesses, whether it's contributing to more transit oriented development, multimodal connectivity, which is basically saying bikes, pedestrians, transit, buses, not everything, cars plus everything else, and also innovative parking solutions. We'd also be looking for whether that development is responding to urban design standards for an improved public realm, for beautification of sort of the sort of public experience, and for sort of the preservation and protection of view corridors. Additionally, as we sort of have talked about, flood risk is a big part of, considering development in this area. And so considering both public access and resilience enhancements is also an important component for development along the waterfront. And finally, last but not least, would like to see some level of commitment from developers to help remediate brownfields where they're present, to contribute to the restoration of the sort of ecological functions of the area, which of course, also circles back to economic impacts in terms of shellfishing and such, and that the sort of characteristics of the development help to improve water quality in the sort of Norwalk Harbor and in Long Island Sound more generally. So it's a lot of kind of specific things, obviously would be balanced in any given situation. But for the marine commercial zone in particular, there's a sort of an existing mix of uses that are water dependent. And then there's a series of special permit and accessory uses that are sort of only allowed when they have a principal use present that is water dependent. So this is the basic sort of conceptual structure of the marine commercial zone. It is designed to protect and support water dependent uses that need to be at the water in order for them to function. So those are things like marinas, docks, ports, fish processing plants, shipyards, marine repair, marine police, harbor master, and waterfront clubs. So all of those things are things that need to be on the water for them to function. And so all these other uses are envisioned as supporting to that primary use. And so it's a really actually a complex zone already. And what we've seen is that in the recent history, there hasn't been significant investment in these other kind of accessory and supporting uses. And then in some cases, there's a need for investment to sort of retrofit these existing water dependent uses to prepare them for increased flood risk, to address sort of economic needs for those businesses. And so what we're looking at is, what can zoning do to better support those existing, water dependent uses, and to sort of troubleshoot some of the reasons why maybe, successful mixed use developments aren't moving forward in this area. And so the primary concept here, which touches on some of the earlier questions about residential development, is to create a framework that essentially limits mixed use development just to the first, these are quite deep parcels, so the first 245 feet of those parcels, and allows for more of a use mix within that part that is closest to Water Street, but prevents those uses from encroaching on water dependent uses that need to be at the water's edge. And this would basically be a tool to drive reinvestment and support for the existing water dependent uses. So the idea is to come up with some parameters that are sufficient to protect the operations of these businesses while providing a sort of complementary revenue stream that can help to sort of provide stability and sustainability going forward as they're confronting these additional costs to their businesses, and additional pressures on their businesses. But it's not just sort of the economics of it, it's also the sort of the overall impact in terms of urban design, in terms of resilience, in terms of environmentally sort of conscious development practices. And so what we'd be looking for is a development typology that is preserving sightlines from Water Street, that is providing limited public access where appropriate, sorry for that, that is potentially providing for a slightly expanded right-of-way along Water Street that would allow for more like flood management infrastructure on Water Street, that would allow for more enjoyable public realm experience for customers. And finally, that would improve water quality through sort of the design of the site itself to sort of capture and treat runoff as much as possible. So what this would look like if you take these sites and sort of move them in section where you're looking at Water Street, and then on the right side of this slide, you see the waterfront parcels, and on the left side, you see the upland or inland parcels. Right now, there's a very low rise development typology that is predominantly marine commercial uses. What we'd be looking at is introducing some upper floor, additional uses, either office or residential, with a ground floor use that is supporting the marine commercial in some way that is complementary to it. And that overall that would help to cross subsidize both reinvestment in resilience infrastructure for the businesses, the water dependent uses on those sites, as well as reduced impervious surfaces, increased public access and sightlines where available, and sort of complete and green streets for Water Street itself, which is an important sort of area in the city to both for transportation, but also for sort of flood risk management. And so this is sort of essentially a concept to use the development controls that the city has to help those primary marine dependent uses, water dependent uses, by helping to fund some of the improvements that are needed in this area in order for these to be sort of viable, long-term, healthy businesses in the area. So with that, the idea would be this new development typology within 245 feet of Water Street would only be allowed if the development demonstrates that it is contributing to the water dependent businesses. So it's retaining, protecting, and reinvesting in water dependent businesses, that it is demonstrating transit-oriented development best practices, that it is meeting the urban design expectations that sort of result in improved public realm, and beautification and view corridors that are, improving the experience of Water Street and of the businesses along it, that it is contributing to increased public access where possible and resilience enhancements, and that it is improving the brownfields, helping to restore ecological function and improving the water quality. So this is, in a sense, it's a lot to ask of a development, which is why we need to offer something in return. So there's a lot of sort of challenges that these developments can help to address, but in order to do so, they need to have some market viability. And so that's the balance that we've been trying to sort of hit with these recommendations in this area. So with that, I imagine there's probably quite a few questions, but before we jump into the Q&A, wanted to get a little bit of feedback on this concept. We did introduce, an earlier version of it at the previous public meeting, but we wanted to sort of fine tune a couple of those ideas. So Michelle, if you want to go ahead and launch the last poll. We're curious what you would like to see in those ground floor uses if a development like this were to move forward. What you think would be most sort of complementary to or supportive of the primary marine dependent uses in this area. And then second, we're looking to understand, in particular for Water Street, if there isn't enough space for all of the potential enhancement that we've described, what kinds of enhancements would you value most? So some of the examples here are like protected bike lanes, sidewalk dining areas, street furniture, green infrastructure, shade trees. These are all things that might improve the ecological function and the sort of experience along Water Street, but they each require space. And so we wanted to understand what you would value most.
All right, we're at like 60. If, couple more seconds.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Okay, so it looks like for those of you who are here today, in terms of ground floor uses, there's a strong preference for customer service, showroom, and retail portions of the existing water dependent businesses. So 77% of you thought that was a good use for the ground floors. And then also a lot of interest in food and beverage, with much less interest in the other options provided. That's really helpful feedback for us. And the second question, which was about investments along Water Street, there was the most interest in green infrastructure, so stormwater management, landscaping along Water Street, if there was not room for all of these sort of ideas, with a secondary interest in sidewalk dining areas and shade trees. Great. Thank you. All right, so we've got a couple of questions here in the queue. So I'll see if I can just sort of jump in here and offer a couple of them. So there was a question that I think actually pertains to our earlier topic of conversation in terms of the capital investments. We have areas designated for marsh expansion with rising sea levels. These areas would need to be filled in to accommodate this. So the marshlands actually do serve as a buffer for the storm events and for flooding events. And so they help to absorb and manage that sort of storm surge. So it would be, you know, those areas I think are being considered in detail for those. So I don't know the sort of the specifics of it, but it would certainly be something that is responding to projected sea level rise and is intended to help protect the city and sort of restore ecological function in those areas. Okay. The next one is a comment that TOD anywhere along the waterfront deserves its own discussion. It's certainly, I think, transit-oriented development is helpful for the city as a whole. And so the waterfront is no exception to that, but it certainly has its own considerations. And so that's what we've attempted to in this study to really reconcile is some of those different factors that need to be balanced with one another. There have been a couple comments on Marina. Our focus was really on the urban inner harbor of Norwalk, and so it wasn't a focus of this study. But I know there's been quite a bit of advocacy around that, the repurposing of that site, and certainly it has some shared issues in terms of its industrial sort of past, but it has not been the focus of our study here, so I don't want to speak out of turn about a preferred future for it. Okay. There's some comments that are similar to what we've heard in the past about the urban design quality of the buildings along Water Street, the importance of not having it feel like a tunnel of high buildings. So that's sort of part of the considerations that we sort of have included so far in terms of sight lines and overall building height. You'll notice that we showed 4 stories versus the 6 stories that exist currently on the other side of the street. So it is a little bit of a smaller scale than some of the things that I think people have responded to negatively so far. Okay. Innovative parking. There's a question about what we intended by that sort of term. And it's not so much the physical design necessarily, but thinking about, for instance, you know, sharing those spaces across different uses that have different time frames, basically different ways to sort of optimize parking so that it's not, you know, sitting vacant and underutilized for large portions of the day. And also thinking about innovative ways to reduce the need for parking so that that space can be used for other functions where possible. Okay. There's a comment about the ONG site. We're certainly in conversations with, you know, I think that there's specific needs here about, you know, I'll just read the question. There's a comment that says, similar question on the ONG plant. There's absolutely no way that they're ever going to reactivate that plant. The city needs to be more assertive with them, or none of the recommendations for the area will ever proceed. So the city is certainly not able to strong arm any property owner into doing something that they don't want to do. This is, you know, the property owners have the sort of control of their property and what they'd like to do with it. The intention here is really just to articulate a long-term vision for what those properties, you know, could be to contribute positively to the city as a whole. So there's certainly, you know, we can't overstep that. That's the bounds of what the city can do. There's a note about the flooding also resulting in boats actually washing up onto Water Street. This is something we've actually heard before so far. So there's a need for development in this area to be able to withstand the impact of debris that's, you know, a result of floodwater. So it's certainly something that developers, you know, can and should be aware of, and would have to be something that's embedded in their own design of those buildings, which is part of why, sort of to my earlier point, that, you know, why even the existing businesses have this problem, right? This is not unique to new development. And in a lot of cases, investment is needed to adequately protect existing buildings as well as new buildings from the reality of the hazards, you know, in the Water Street area, because there is significant flood risk. So it's definitely a delicate balance. Okay. There's a comment about an interest in having a sponge park near Water Street. I think that there's certainly a need for flood management in that area, but it is an active, you know, economically vibrant area that already has existing property owners. So there's the publicly owned parcels elsewhere in the city are more well suited to maybe absorb some of that need and help out the Water Street area. And certainly there's some sites, you know, at a site scale, there's some things that those properties can do to contribute to water absorption and flood risk management, but it's not realistic at this time to expect those businesses to turn over their property to become a sponge park. Okay. A lot of the other comments are kind of in a similar kind of themes here. I don't know if for the rest of the team, if there's any others that you kind of see here that you want to kind of pick out and respond to.
Sorry, I'm trying to work my way through the chat. So if
yeah,
specific questions for me, please feel free to.
Yeah, I think there's a one question is about the aesthetic of the diagrams we're proposing. Those aren't the aesthetic of the buildings. I think, you know, the city plans to include more detailed design guides to help shape, you know, what new development might look like in that area. Those are just very simple, what we call sugar cube massings, just to understand relative heights and to understand kind of site coverage and things. So I promise you there won't be yellow smooth buildings coming along Water Street. I think the other question is, how will building out Water Street help local residents living in residential B and C zone neighborhoods? I think one answer is that properly framed, the zoning can require flood mitigation solutions by reinvestment of the properties on the east side of Water Street as a condition for being able to develop. And so private development is part of the answer for dealing with the flooding along Water Street. Certainly there has to be public monies brought to the table too. But a lot of that, because that development edge that Zoe showed is between the water and Water Street, there are things that can happen on site that can help mitigate the flooding there, especially over time when more of those properties are redeveloped. I think also, you know, I think the changes to that side of Water Street will make Water Street itself, through the things that those parcel owners are obligated to do, make Water Street a more walkable street with wider sidewalks and better designed crosswalks, and again, the kind of stormwater management issues.
Thanks, Tim.
Oh, and I just I'm picking up on the point about the aesthetic. I appreciate the comment about you know, the design aesthetic and kind of issues of character. So we can talk about those issues with the city and the way that design guidelines might be able to affect some of the things that anonymous attendee raised in the chat.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to just accept some of these. There was a note about the 245-foot depth that in the areas north of Hanford Place, that those would be most of those lots in marine commercial. So the within those smaller parcels that are closer to Washington Street, they have slightly different, characteristics like what you've kind of already listed here. And the way that this concept would adapt to those parcels would be slightly different from the sort of the diagrams that we're showing here. It would really be kind of negotiate those relationships more closely. I think in a lot of those, the sort of smaller parcels, they do have marina uses that use a smaller sort of portion of it. So it's kind of a site specific consideration. But
yeah, I think the short answer is that whereas the depth of those parcels narrow down, we would change that dimension to make it so it has the same logic and it's proportional to the deeper parcels. So that's still to be worked out, and probably worked out even at the rezoning scale, if not in this plan. But we can make a point that general rule set that we set up would have to be looked at more closely in the rezoning effort.
Yeah, and the sort of the main the thing that drove that dimension is really the sort of typical market-driven dimensions of these types of buildings. And so there's a sort of a value proposition there to sort of allocating that amount of space. But regardless of those dimensions across the entire marine commercial zone, there would still be the same parameter that's in there now that requires a primary water dependent use in order to access any of the other development options. So there is a sort of a level of protection in there that exists, at a base level before kind of even adding this note about the dimensional area in which other development typologies can be introduced. Okay. There's a question about traffic study on Water Street, in particular when the bridge is open. That was it's a little bit outside of the scope of what this study focused on. So I think it's an issue that we've heard about. I think it's something that will probably merit further sort of study. Subsequently, certainly within this study, what we sort of looked at more closely is, what are the options for Water Street to, be on its own accord to sort of support more different kinds of transportation, which may help in some ways with congestion. But I think that this is sort of its own challenge that has more to do with the overall road network and connectivity across the river, that land use itself is not going to be able to address. And the improvements that we've described along Water Street are not at the expense of vehicular travel lanes. They would be in addition to the existing travel lanes. So it would not have a negative impact on that travel, that sort of level of congestion.
That's right. Any improvements to pedestrian accommodations would be a requirement on private property as a condition for development. There would be no decrease in travel lanes, as Zoe is saying.
See, there's a couple of questions about the number of units that would be added across the entirety of the Water Street commercial, the marine commercial zone on Water Street, if this development typology were to move forward. Our expectation is that it would not be implemented across every parcel to its maximum potential. So we haven't calculated it in that across the entire marine commercial area. There is already an allowance for multifamily residential within this area. So it isn't a new, a concept for this district. It's really just taking that use and confining it to that 245-foot buffer off of Water Street, and sort of making clearer parameters for under what conditions you can do multifamily residential. And certainly it would, there's other uses that would be considered for that area as well. We're not implying that residential is the only use that should move forward in this area as a complement to the existing marine commercial water dependent uses. Okay. There's a couple of other comments about kind of the congestion or sort of bike pedestrian vehicular conflicts along Water Street. Again, it wasn't the focus of our study, but I think it's an important consideration moving forward as we look at, the potential for improvements and investments in, improved, let's say, crosswalk infrastructure or things like that that might be able to more effectively manage the existing conflicts there. But again, that's sort of outside of the scope of what we were taking on in this study. Okay. Couple other ones here. There's a question as to whether the rezoning are conditions for positive change in the neighborhoods. And, I'd say that our framework here is intended to pair market development opportunities with the priorities that we heard from members of the public and stakeholders for what kind of positive change they'd like to see. So we're basically taking those two and trying to match them up so that there's a clear connection between the kinds of development that the developers might come in wanting to do, and lining those things up with what we heard from the public and from stakeholders that you want to see here, and sort of making sure that the zoning is well set up to manage those expectations and to sort of ensure wherever possible that future development is contributing positively. Okay.
Zoe, do we want to, I don't know how much more you wanted to go through unless you wanted to take, and I know there are a couple of people with hands raised. I know they've been up for a while. Do we want to do any?
Yeah.
Just Q&A? We're seems to be going in circles on the.
Yeah, there's a couple of overlapping issues. Yeah.
Questions out. We have probably about 20 minutes or so, I think.
Yeah, can I ask, John Romano asked an excellent question at the end, and I want to respect John partly because of his time he's put into the process on the steering committee. John, we haven't calculated the units per acre yet because it's related to that being a little bit more clear about the that zone along Water Street, how deep it is for the deep parcels, and then how thin it gets as it gets further north. And I think as soon as we determine some of those things, we could generate a rough estimate of how many total units we're talking about, then how many units per acre kind of averaged across the whole thing. It would be a hypothetical maximum because it would be how much, maximum possible based on our sightline requirements and the setbacks you could get. But that's something that we can figure out, just to respond directly. I was going to type it, but thought that was more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think, why don't we recognize anyone with raised hands at this point? Michelle, are you able to see the kind of the sequence of?
Sure, and if you'd like to be seen, just let me know. I'll have to press an additional button. Oh, well.
I'll stop sharing the slides for now so that we can.
You just have to unmute yourself, Tom. And then if you'd like to be on video, let me know. Tom, you just have to unmute if you're having trouble. We can't hear you.
No, I have no comment. I'm sorry. I may have done that intentionally.
Okay. Well,
Sorry, Michelle.
no worries.
It looks like, I think that's it for people with raised hands, right?
Yep. Oh. Okay. I'm not sure if Mr. Garcia wants to speak or not, but I'm assuming Tom still did it by accident. So I think we're clear.
Okay. Great. So I think then maybe in the interest of time, out of respect for all of you, I think I'll go ahead and share my screen and just offer kind of some of our closing thoughts. And I think we can, from there, we can share with you a little bit of, from all the questions that we received tonight. We'll be preparing a draft plan that sort of takes the big picture of what we shared with you tonight, incorporate some of the feedback and questions that we heard from you, making adjustments based on those. And we'll be sharing a draft plan, full kind of report that'll be kind of circulated for public comment and then move through the formal adoption process. So this is, not the last opportunity to provide comment, but is, an important checkpoint for us to sort of get a feeling for key issues, things that maybe need more clarification or more kind of clear explanation to, present the full range of what we've kind of heard back from you all. I don't know if for Tim and Steve, if there's any kind of closing comments you want to offer.
Yeah, I want to be clear that that our recommendations, especially in the marine commercial area east of Water Street, which has been, a lot of the focus because of, investment interest there, our recommendations will include obligations, requirements that developers have to meet before they can build in that, to be determined finally zone that we're talking about. And those requirements include maintaining and enhancing marine commercial uses with specific quantifiable stipulations about what that means. It might mean upgrading and increasing numbers of docks. It might, the kind of prescriptions we'll partly have in our recommendations, but will get worked out through the zoning. It'll be requirements for on-site flood mitigation that helps reduce the impact on Water Street and public lands as part of the re-engineering of the site. It's going to include recommendations for buffer zones at the water's edge so that there isn't surface runoff from impervious surfaces directly into the harbor. And so all of those things will be requirements that would have to be met to allow development to happen. And I want to reiterate that that investment in those parcels will mean that the marine commercial uses and the life of Norwalk at the water's edge will be preserved and enhanced moving forward, hopefully for generations to come. So just wanted to qualify that again. I don't know, Steve, do you have other general comments you want to make?
Just a couple of, and not to prolong the chat till midnight, but I saw a couple comments in there that I think were just unfair might be the wrong word, but just misguided. I think there are several areas within the plan where one of the recommendations is to consider parkland or open space adjacent to the water. Keep in mind that all these parcels we're talking about are private property. So the city, as indicated, just can't go in and take these properties. They have to be, a mechanism in place to, if the city wanted to acquire them for a park. In areas which are already marine commercial, the number one goal and recommendation is to maintain the water dependency of those properties and to ensure their viability. That's the goal of the plan. So while I think there's maybe, the only place we're talking about where looking at what the existing regulations are related to different kinds of developments is along, the main Water Street area. Other areas are, I think there's a mix of uses because there are different uses that are appropriate. And lastly, there is no pressure or no indication or trying to comply with any mandates from the state of Connecticut regarding density or development within the city as a whole, and particularly as it relates to this plan. That's been repeated several times, but there couldn't be anything further from the truth.
I think with that, I know that there are several kind of, more detailed comments that we have certainly take note of, but out of respect for everybody's time, I think we should go ahead and close out for today's meeting. Please do keep an eye out for the draft plan. And in the meantime, if you have questions or comments, you can reach out to Steve and Michelle and check back on the city's, the Norwalk Tomorrow site to learn of the release of the draft plan for public comment. We really appreciate your time and your sort of devotion to the city of Norwalk and helping us to make sure that this is a balanced plan that really addresses sort of the complex sets of issues that these waterfront properties are contending with. So appreciate your time and hope you all have a good evening. And we'll look forward to hearing from you more as we get to the final stretches of this planning process.
Okay, good night. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.